Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the FinTech4Good Sustainable Housing Roundtable series. And this is our fourth roundtable, and this one that we're focusing on transforming sustainable housing sector through digital innovation. And we have a good line of speakers who will just share with you, from their perspective, and just some background about this roundtable, and also, why do we organize this? And we all know that housing sector need a lot of change, and digital innovation play a very important role to just help this sector to becoming more effective and also cost effective. And hopefully that's through our joint work from us and our partners, that we can just make the housing affordable, eco-friendly, smart, healthy, and safe. And so to do that, we are planning to launch Sustainable Housing Accelerator program. And this is a 10-week virtual acceleration program, and will help those digital innovation enabled sustainable housing solutions to just grow bigger and better. And to prepare for that, we launched a Sustainable Housing Task Force, where Anne and I are co-chairing, and joined by many of the industry leaders. And Ferris is one of the member of the task force. And in the past few months that we are working together to just get everything ready. And the roundtable is really one of the vehicle that we try to bring the different partners together, and trying to just showcase what worked, what might have challenge to be implemented, and what are the existing solutions out there. And from the first one, we talked about digital infrastructure, and then the second one we talked about tokenization. The third one we talked about real challenge for the municipalities, and how digital innovation can make or have made an impact, with some example from China. And this is the fourth one. And I really welcome everyone, all our panelists. And of course, that we appreciate all of you who are here with us. And without further ado, I would like to just give the floor to Anne, my co-chair, to just moderate the session.
Great. And Shashan, it looks like I cannot share my screen. So if we fix that, I have one slide. Otherwise, I can certainly talk without that. So first of all, I just want to thank all of our panelists who are here today. I think you're in for a really interesting conversation, and I will introduce. Oh, very good. All right. Great. All right. So when I got involved in this, I think it's a really interesting problem that we have. Housing, as almost everybody knows, has grown very unaffordable in many parts of the world, in cities where people can be close to jobs and so forth. In addition to unaffordable, as opposed to other consumer products, that housing stock has not really improved much in terms of eco-friendliness and smart and new features compared to other products. So we hypothesize that one of the issues is digital innovations that were prevalent in other kinds of consumer goods that have not really made it into the housing sector. And we asked the question, why? And so we put together this very high-level value chain that talks about, on the top side, from the time of development through the financing, both of the financing of the development as well as the financing of the properties to individuals, as well as the operations. You can see in the private sector there are numbers, hundreds of different entities that are involved in each part of this particular value chain. And then in addition to the private sector, we have the public sector, the government piece of this, as well as nonprofits who are really important as well. The public sector lays the groundwork, the regulations, and they also have technology and infrastructure that are supposed to support the private sector. And the nonprofits' role really is involved in being close to the community, providing subsidy. Housing, after all, is a human right as opposed to some other types of consumer goods. So this is really a coordinated effort. And if it all works well, and everything else is a graphic except the one in the middle, I couldn't help but leave it because I love the idea that if it all works well, then the traffic flows well. And if not, you can see what a mess it is. And so the three guests that we have today are all experts in sort of the development and public-private partnerships, which I think is so important in this context. So to give you a little bit of context, we have starting us off, Faraz Kumseya, who's an experienced real estate development executive focused on affordable housing, public-private urban development, large mixed-use and transit-oriented development. He's responsible for managing a team of developers on all aspects of development, from concept, acquisition, underwriting, due diligence, planning, entitlement, and through the vertical construction and closeout. And he's going to start us off with a good description of the problem statement. And he is also on our Sustainable Housing Task Force, so thank you very much for us. And then he's going to turn it over to George Thomas. George is a thought leader and advisor to public and private sector organization in the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. With over 23 years of experience, George has held a variety of sales strategy and consulting roles. A dynamic leader and team builder, George has helped clients develop successful strategies and execute transformational projects in business operations, capital improvements, enterprise processes, organizational change management, strategic planning. George is the co-founder of New Urban Informatics, a boutique advisory firm providing expertise to some of the most innovative companies and governments focused on public sector analytics and smart cities. And he's also the VP of Innovation and Strategic Initiatives at Connected DMV. And then finally, closing us out, we have Sergio Fernandez de Cordova. Sergio is a world-leading expert on innovative public-private multi-stakeholder governance models, from shaping social initiatives, regulatory frameworks, to smart city planning, policy and programs. Sergio co-founded P3 Smart City Partners, Things, P3GM, Captain, Fuel Outdoor, and the PVBLIC Foundation. In all his work, he leads the global development and policy work behind structuring public-private partnerships and around smart infrastructure and policy framework with local, state, and federal governments. So really a powerhouse panel. I am so looking forward to this conversation. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will send it over to Faraz to get us kicked off.
Good morning, thank you. And I'm going to try to share my screen and let me know if you can see it. All right. And now I go to, all right, can you see it?
Yeah.
Very good. Well, good morning, thank you. And it's a very humbling introduction. I appreciate being part of this discussion. I think we are at a very critical stage in our lives in general for many different reasons. One of the reasons is that a fundamental basic right that people have, which is to have shelter and to live in homes, is being challenged because we have a housing production problem in this country and worldwide. As a developer, I see this every day, I live it. And one of the things that I focus on and think about all the time is how can we increase housing production? How can we build more housing to meet the ongoing demand? One thing that they don't make of anymore on this earth is land. So land is scarce, but people continue to grow. And so we need to continue to meet the demand of housing production. And so with that, My agenda for the conversation today is, why is there a housing crisis? You hear about housing crisis, and it's kind of a trendy subject, but what is the housing crisis? And I'm going to talk about it at a very, very high level nutshell. And then in order to understand what the problem is, we need to just do diagnosis. And part of that is, what is the housing production life cycle looks like today? As someone who builds housing all day, there is a life cycle that we go through. That is a typical life cycle. And then when we go through it, we'll understand what the timeline and challenges at every stage of that life cycle. And then once we understand those challenges, we can start to begin to understand where the opportunities. And my job really today is to present you the problems in hope that we can begin to identify technologies that can help us. And there are already technologies happening in other parts of the world. And some of them, from my position where I sit, it's just not yet scalable. And I'd love to get involved in a conversation. How can we scale technology to become the mainstream to help solve the housing crisis? With that, let's dive in. I mean, it's the housing crisis is simply supply and demand issue. If you look at this chart, the chart basically shows on the left-hand side of the solid, shows the housing demand at a different income level. AMI is the area median income for a particular region, and this is for the United States. As you can see, those people who are at very extremely low income, there is an 11.2 million. This is again 2016, and the situation just has exacerbated since then. 11.2 million of housing demand, while there's only 4 million of housing supply for that segment of population. As you go through the income level, you will see how there's a little bit more housing available, and the above medium income population, there's more supply than there is demand, just a little bit more supply, although I would argue by the time where we are today in 2020, this balance is probably imbalanced at this point. And so essentially there's a shortage at the very low income of about 7.2 million in rental housing, affordable and available to extremely low income family. Why is that? And we're going to talk about that a little bit. So the housing, let's understand, and probably most of you who operate in this space kind of understand this on a high level. But let's go through it really quick. So the life cycle of a project, there's project conception, then pre-development, then construction, then closeout, and then the asset gets placed in operations. So what happens at the project conception? It's basically when you find a site, you see, okay, what's the highest and best use for that site? What am I going to build on it? Am I going to put a mixed use high rise or a low rise with townhome rentals or single family? And you underwrite it, you figure out the highest and best use, you figure out what the zoning you need to go through, and then you go through the acquisition process. Once you acquire the site, then you go through, most of the time, these sites require you to go through a public zoning process. Once you go through what we call entitlement and zoning process, and then basically you develop your plan, almost halfway through, you go through the entitlement process, you get the entitlement approval, then you go through a permitting process. Once you go through that permitting process, along that process, you're going also through a community engagement, as well as you're going through the entitlement process. You're going through a community engagement process where you share your ideas, what it is that you want to build. Sometimes there are community benefits agreements that gets negotiated along the process, and then you understand how much the project is going to cost you, what's your financing sources. You go through the financing process, and you're ready to go for closing on the construction. We call it, the construction closing is essentially a big event, because at this point you have gone through all of the soft development process, and now you're ready to begin to go vertical, or to actually start digging the dirt to build your project. And that, I'm going to break it down in really two basic phases. One is site work and infrastructure, where you clear the site, you dig up the site, You put in all of the horizontal infrastructure, and then you go through vertical construction. Then along the way, you have inspection, and I list the inspection here because they do hold up the process. They hold up the process, and there could be streamlining for that, and we'll talk about it a little bit. So now that we finish the construction, we get our final inspection, we turn over the project to our asset management group. I'm going to just take a step back and talk a little bit about the organization I work for. It's called Folger Pratt Development. It's a region, it's a national firm headquartered in the Mid-Atlantic region in the United States. And we're vertically integrated, meaning we have our own acquisition group, we have our own development group, we have our own construction company, and we have our own property management company. And the advantage that this gives us is we get involved at granular level in every aspect of this life cycle. We know what the problems are, we know how to diagnose them, and we create a more seamless integration. And it comes with pluses and minuses, but there are more pluses than minuses. And part of the plus is really control. We control our risk. See, developers are in the business of managing risk. And when you're managing the life cycle production of housing, you're really managing risk. Now let's talk about the timeline. And some of you may not, may be surprised. Some of you may say, okay, well, that's, that's normal. So in the project conception phase, it could go anywhere from 3 months to plus. I mean, when you find a site, you negotiate an initial letter of intent, then you negotiate a contract, then you go through your due diligence phase, and you go through your closing process. The fastest that I've seen done it in probably 60 days, that's record time, but typically 3 to 6 months of acquisition, where you define what's the highest and best use, and you do your due diligence for that acquisition. On the pre-development side, then once you have site acquisition or site control, you may not buy the land, you may just put it under control through a contract. You go through your entitlement and zoning. That could take anywhere from 12 to 36 months, sometimes longer. And unless the project is by right, where you don't have to go through any zoning process, which is seldom in the United States, at least in the regions we operate in, it could take somewhere from 12 to 36 months through community engagement, through public hearings, through back and forth. Once you get your zoning, you essentially now have the right to build the concept that you have developed. Now you have to go through the technical process of the permitting. See, the entitlement is what it does. It tells you, as a landowner, you have the right to build a program. And generally the program looks like this, this is how many stories, this is the different uses, and so on and so forth. Now then you go through the permitting process to make sure that your drawings meet code. And that could take anywhere from 18 to 14 months, sometimes longer. I haven't seen anything done before less than 6 months. The average is 18 to 14. Then once you complete that process, you go through your financing. And the reason I didn't list financing here because you're really doing concurrently with your permitting process. By the time you get your permits, you're ready to close. So you're doing your financing through the 12 to 13s. Then construction. Site work typically takes anywhere from 6 to 12 months, and especially in more urban areas, in cities, where you have to dig a hole or you have to clear a site. And so if you have to build underground parking, it takes longer. If you don't, it takes a little bit less. And vertical construction, it takes anywhere from 18 to 30 months for a multifamily project. I mean, if you're building townhomes, and depends, and I'm referring to this average, we're not talking about one home or two homes, we're talking about multifamily or production, 150, 200, 300 units at a given time. And I should have defined what when I'm talking about what project size I'm referring to. So it takes approximately 47 to 95 months, approximately, on average, to build a housing projects that you see on the street when you walk by your city. And so, sometimes I've had some kids who've changed from elementary school to middle school before projects has completed. It really takes a long time. And in the meantime, the demand, we continue to have increase in population. Land cost, like you said, they don't make land anymore. Land cost continues to go up. Construction costs continue to escalate, and the reason, construction costs, because we are seeing more and more shortage of skilled laborers. Tariffs cause material costs to continue to escalate, and because now it costs more to build homes, you have to increase your sales prices or your rent prices to make up for it, and to meet. Investors have to meet threshold of return. So if you look, I found this chart that shows essentially the increase in average sales prices of new homes sold in the U.S. since 1963, and you can see the trend, and that trend continued to grow, and there's no indication of anything other than that. When you bought your big flat screen TV, you probably paid an arm of a leg for it years ago. Now you buy it for a few $100s. Construction is one of the very few only industries that continue to escalate over time, versus the pricing versus other industries where there's innovation. I'll go to the next slide. These are just very basic slide that essentially shows you the median sales over, just in the past 7 years. You can see they continue to grow. The cost of construction material are on the rise. This is a chart, essentially the past 12 or 13 years. You can, and big part of it is shortage of skilled labor, one, but also tariffs and materials, and all of this continue to go higher. Look at this, is a very, very telling chart. The rents have dramatically outpaced wage growth, which leads really to a more cost-burdened household. Cost-burdened household mean households that are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. And if you can see from 1960 to 2015, look at the wage trends and compare that to the rent. We really are seeing a curve that's going farther and farther apart, and that is leading to the housing crisis. So if you put all of this together, and this is the last slide, and we can turn it over, is they're low-hanging fruits, which is essentially, I put them in two buckets. Can we reduce the time, the life cycle to build? Can we build faster? And can we build cheaper? This is what I spend all my time on, is how can we build our projects faster, and how can we build them at a lower price? And when I say at a lower price, I don't mean lower quality. Can we actually reduce the cost to build homes? So for the reduced time it takes to entitle and permit a home, there's a lot of discussions regionally in the United States about how we can fix our zoning process. One idea is we create a matter of right development zones with certain predefined proffers, so people don't have to go through that 12 to 36 months of entitlement process. This comes with challenges because some people say, well, the community should, and the community should be involved, but there are more effective ways of involving the communities to develop homes. Can we streamline the zoning process? If you have to go through a zoning process, does it have to take 12 to 13 to 36 months? Can we streamline the building permitting process? Building permits process is nothing but building codes that are predefined. Can we use artificial intelligence where it doesn't take me 6 to 12 months to get for somebody to review the plans? Can it go through a system and identify all of the gaps in the plans compared to code, and can it quickly give me feedback so my architect and my engineers can fix that and without having to go through that life cycle? Now, can we reduce time and cost to construct? There's a lot of discussion on modular and offsite construction, and I love it. I follow the industry very closely. I've toured several factories, and I've been trying to underwrite a project here in DC to to build it modular. And unfortunately, the cost and schedule benefits in an urban landfill project still are not fully realized. It costs me more money and almost just as much time to build modular construction in Washington, D.C. And I think we're going to get there, and hopefully soon, but it's not yet mainstream where we can it's not up to scale where we can fully realize the benefits. And with that, and I conclude the presentation.
Great. Why don't we turn it over to George and get your perspective?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Faraz. That was a very illuminating to see from a developer point of view where we currently stand in looking at it. When I look at the topic of sustainable housing, there's multiple kind of very similar sounding words, but threads that are quite different, that I think the nuances are important. There is sustainable from the point of view of green and environmentally friendly. There's sustainable from the perspective of sustainable financial model and revenue-wise, that what we build can actually be used. And then there is affordable, which is a whole different segment of thought process. And I think sometimes we tend to confuse the terminology and the words to try to bring them all together. But there are three different problem sets that have intersected in this particular space quite a lot, especially in the last decade and a half. And a lot of that intersection has been caused by advancements in technology and business models. I mean, we've been building houses for 10,000 years. We've been doing developments and trying to find places for people to live for 10,000 years. We've been building cities for 5,000 years. Not a whole lot has changed in the thinking from the fact that you need to figure out where to build it, how to build it. The materials we use for the most part are the same. And what you need to do to make sure they're safe and they have a lifespan of, let's say, 20 years to 50 years. Not a lot has changed. The pressures of the number of people that are in our societies has increased, but not that significantly that this has become a big issue. There are other larger forces that are coming to play. And when you look at all of that, and let me expand a little bit, I guess, on the continuum of the asset life cycle that Faraz started. So you start from development, go through planning and design, then you go into financing and construction. But once you build it, then you have an operate phase of the life cycle. Then you have to think about maintenance and sustaining that maintenance for as long as you can. And then you have a point of feasible capital expenditure versus operating expenditure to upgrade it, whether it's worth it. And at some point in time, you get to end of life for the asset that you have to manage. So if you think about extending that thought process to the very end, are there places where we have built affordable housing or just segments of land or triple deckers in the 50s, 60s, 70s that it would make more sense to reclaim the land now and do something else with it with a larger extension, are things that we also need to think about with the new world thinking of like circular and sustainable economy and what that means and how we live. And with COVID-19 especially, are we going to continue to create the mass flow into urban centers, or is that going to take a little bit more of a back seat and people start moving back into suburbs and rural countryside as long as there's connectivity? Is more kind of larger trends that we need to think about. Where I've kind of come at this for the last couple of decades in my life has been from a technology or a business model perspective. Now, if I just look at technology across all of the silos that Faraz mentioned, there are many ways to improve the time scale, make it happen faster, improve the quality, better lower the risk and the safety of how we do it, using varieties of technologies that some are nascent, some are happening today. Some of the more common ones that have become more prevalent today are AR, VR, drones for safety checks, automation for construction, automation for maintenance. There's also now the whole thread, I think it's still a little nascent, around 3D printing of houses. It's still a little expensive, but that'll only decrease over time as we become more efficient at it and as the scale gets bigger and bigger. So there are technology-led things that can reduce risk, improve productivity, therefore reduce time to actually having an asset, and improve the scalability of what we are able to achieve. And those will continue in piece parts across our industry. The one advantage we in construction and design, build, and affordable housing have is that many of the things that would help us have been tried and tested in other adjacent industries and pretty much worked out on what it is. We have to adopt and absorb what that is for our space. Example, ports and airports have been well afront of where this is. If you look at the mining sector, they've done tremendous amounts of really cool, innovative technology leaps with how they're providing and managing all of this. What are the lessons learned in digital technology and even business models that we can then absorb into affordable housing to improve the pace and scale of the number of units we have, how we live in those units, how we maintain and manage those units, how can we get more productivity out of the lifespan of those units, I think are all possible. And there are many, many projects and examples underway to try to figure out what that is. The other thread besides just affordable, going more into the sustainable and the green, is the whole trend towards renewables and trying to figure out how do we incorporate renewables into the units that we're building. How do we incorporate connectivity is the second big thread that's happening, especially after COVID-19 and when most of us are holed up in our homes and trying to figure out how to sustain a living for the next at least 18 months, it looks like. Connectivity has become a big, major issue. And if you think back on the initial chart from Faraz on the segments of society that have the most stress on housing, the lower two segments of society, if you put a map on digital divide, those are the exact two segments that don't have connectivity. All of the big telco providers in the world have clauses where they don't go into certain units, they don't go into certain parts of a city because it's not financially viable for them to make their money, but they are not, they are not forced to go do it. Therefore, what this creates is entire communities now that don't have access, cannot have kids go through K-12 school, don't have ability to do jobs that are remote because of access. So if you combine the availability of housing to the availability of jobs and quality of life of people in that housing, then you have this three-layered complex scenario that we have to think through. How do we and what do we need to do to bring that together? And a lot of the work that I'm involved with, both at my venture studio and with Connected DMV. Connected DMV is a regional private public academia, federal government organization that's a not-for-profit that is looking after 6.5 million people in the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area. And Connected DMV was essentially created because we had trouble bringing the right parties to the table about many things, of which affordable housing and connectivity for all are two of the major threads that we are looking at, especially since COVID-19, connectivity for all and access to housing and from access to jobs from where these housings are located have both become very, very crucial elements. So I think the world is now starting to recognize what some of these pieces are. There are issues related to where the funding comes from, the strings that come with it. There are issues related to policy and issues related to inspections and approvals. There are issues related to zoning. But at the end of the day, I think where this comes to a head is where the initial funding that comes to fill the gap between the types of residents and citizens who need access to housing, where those housing can be located so that they can then sustain and improve their quality of life is going to be the critical element that we all have to discuss and look at. We can spend hours talking about both the tech and the business models, blockchain being one of them, that are being experimented around today to try to see how we can change piece parts of this. And I think they're all needed and viable. But as we continue to look for places to do things at scale, I don't think that will be possible unless we get to a point where we can do that public-private academic research partnership to come together on specific causes within that asset lifecycle continuum and try to tackle them a little bit more holistically. With that, Anne, let me pass it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'd like to now turn it over to Sergio to give your perspective. And then we've got some great questions coming in, so keep them going. We will have some time at the end so that you can ask them directly to your panelists.
Excellent. Thank you, Anne. Just really exciting to be part of this. And George, thanks for your comments as well as, it was great to hear Faraz's really, overview of the marketplace. A lot of the work that we do is more focused on sort of structuring public policy, and we do a lot of work on digital transformation and looking at sort of what is the digital policy transformation. and as George also mentioned, financing, how do you actually build models that are inclusive and can finance digital urban innovation, right? Digital empowerment and capacity building. A lot of the ways of actually, being able to finance projects isn't just, how many penthouses you're going to build or how many big buildings or how many people you could fit, but really also how you advance in the community. What is the economic development that is happening in that region, in that city? What are the hub and spoke models that plug in? Some of the work that we do with our foundation, and it's public, PVBLSE public, and we do with the foundation is really focus on, doing work with UN Habitats, with the UNECE, public policy, and looking at people, sort of focused public-private partnerships that help us, rebuild communities. Now more than ever, with COVID and a pandemic, not just globally, but, in our own backyard in America, we have a serious problem. We have a big rebuilding. We've gone back 30 years and we need to rebuild communities. We have people in our country suffering more than in other parts of the world that we don't even see it. And, some of the mechanisms and tools of financing are obviously much easier to engage here in the US than they are outside of the US. One of the projects that we had, we started a couple of years ago, actually 3 years ago, is a fund called Imperative Fund, where we basically grabbed a community, an entire sort of small town, and invested and built a model that actually Columbia University, highlighted, built a model of sort of engineering social enterprise and rebuilding an entire community from the bottom up. And making an investment dollars, sort of the vehicle that allows us to rebuild everything from the road, the infrastructure, but adding digital infrastructure, adding sort of, as one would say, smart and digital technologies, so that we could also eradicate, poverty tax, right? So that we have shared resources, shared infrastructure, and really addressing what the community needs, right? A lot of times when people are in a development space, they are addressing what the money needs, where the money is flowing, and what is really missing in the sort of sustainable development, right? As we're looking at digital and sort of sustainable development, is actually taking a step back and looking at saying, okay, what does the community need? So, a couple of years ago, we got involved and decided to really, make a big investment into, building this community from the ground up. And our goal on the investment category was to be able to return 100% of the investment funds while generating, market returns and return on community, right? The return on community is a variable that a lot of folks in these sort of, as one would say, for-profit, not impact, but for-profit, don't even see, right? Their return on community is a pool, a gym, outdoor space, right? But, when you start to look at, sustainable development and real impact, you need multi-stakeholder conversations. You need private sector, public sector, government sector. You need nonprofits. You need proper framework, proper regulatory, framework as well, to be able to put fiber down and digitization, and not to make it smart city, but rather to actually make it usable, cut costs, increase services, and improve the lives of people, right? And I think, now, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, it really is an opportunity to leapfrog development. Right, it's an opportunity because we are over innovated as a world. We have anything and everything at our fingertips. We have the ability to do whatever. And now, when we are looking at those that are least developed areas, and those that don't have access to housing, well, we're working on a project right now in the U.S. We're working with 22 communities, and we're making a sort of restructuring these communities so that we can cut costs, increase value, but just sort of digital transformation. And, you'd be surprised, how still even today, as the gentlemen were both saying, we're still, not realizing the full potential of what can be done. And so to me, it's been really exciting to kind of been doing this for almost a decade specifically, and watching, the global transformation, but then also looking at our own backyard here in the US. And, you know, in Mexico, we were able to do this in less than 2 years already, rebuilt almost an entire community. And in the US, I couldn't get that done in 10 years. If I said I was going to, you know, build 2,500 homes and literally, you know, transform how they live from living in dirt, mud homes to actually having a real house with a floor, with water, with electricity, with connectivity, with a community center so their kids could actually access computer technology, and with everyone actually, you know, having no digital divide. And so, you know, to me, I think there's an incredible opportunity. Excited to speak about this and happy to dive into it more. But, you know, I think we are at a leapfrog time in development, real estate development and community development and development overall. And so anyway, I'll stop there, but definitely excited to kind of, you know, bring different perspective into this conversation.
Thank you so much, Sergio. So Shashan, do you want to promote a couple of folks who perhaps ask questions? And it looks like maybe some other folks who have been on to kind of make it a little bit more interactive for the question and answers.
Yes, that's probably just from the sequence when we just received the question, and let's start from Nancy. Yeah.
Nancy, I think you're on mute, but you're welcome to start speaking. You've been promoted.
Great. Hi. Thank you very much for the panelists that have spoken and for the presentations that you gave. Extremely informative and well thought through, and look forward to meeting each of you and collaborating together on this project. One of the questions that I had predominantly was around the technology piece regarding sort of the build faster, build cheaper. One of the ways that we have been able to address the build cheaper is to work toward annihilating the diversion and fraud of capital within the investment cycle for the production of affordable housing. We're working predominantly in Africa and Southeast Asia right now with the platform, but the World Bank has mentioned that only 55 cents out of every dollar actually goes into a construction project for its intended purpose. I think probably more in the developed country, we're looking at maybe not so much as a direct diversion as happens on the ground in developing countries where cash is the main form of payment. But in the US, on projects that I've worked on, even in low-income housing tax credits, I see where there's inflated pricing and just really trying to bulk up the amount of the total cost of the building because you're paid as a percentage of that cost. So just sort of going back to that number, I think that 55 cents on the dollar sort of realized due to different factors regarding it, whether you're a developing country or not, but it's still that same issue remains. My question to you is sort of in this age of new technology where, blockchain contracts and being able to have bids on a single platform that are transparent to the entire ecosystem, holding people accountable because of e-wallets and traceability of payments, and pulling them out of a cash system onto a sort of a FinTech platform for full traceability. I truly believe that we have now the technology that's able to eliminate this fraud and to build cheaper. If we could actually, instead of 55 cents on the dollar, have even 85 cents or a full dollar out of the dollar going to the project, it's as if we're cutting the cost in half. So we're doubling the value of that capital going in. So I'm curious, what kinds of exploration have you done in this area, if at all, towards addressing the issue of building cheaper? Because I think it's predominantly been sort of a materials discussion, and I would just like to push us a little bit further on that to think more broadly about other ways to eliminate costs.
I can chime in. I mean, I agree with you that the majority of the cost, that there is a significant streamlining and waste that could happen when you are financing low-income housing tax credit. I mean, the cost of the overall total development cost of a project is much higher than a conventional project. And part of it is because you're financing through government subsidies, and the cost to do that is just, your financing fees, your percentage, just the cost structure is just a lot higher. Your bond counts, all of this. But and I absolutely don't want to discount that, Nancy. There can be significant improvements to that cost structure, but when you look at the overall total development cost, the hard construction cost remains as 60% or so of the total development project. So that has to be addressed. Now, in addition to that, I agree, I'd love to learn more about your platform, because there's a lot of redundancy and inefficiency in the way that we aggregate information today to manage a project through the pre-development and through the construction closing. And there are inefficiencies that result in higher costs there, but also there's inherently the way that we're structured to develop affordable housing that has government subsidies in. We're inherently structured more expensive than, when you have, HFA financing, you have all of the bond councils, you have the LIHTC itself. It probably cost me, 10 to 20% higher on average to develop a project that's low income housing tax credit than a conventional project. And then let alone on the hard construction side, you also have to pay more because now you have to meet Davis-Bacon wages, or you have to meet more than Davis-Bacon. So anyway, I don't want to get into the detail, but to build low-income housing costs more money, but you're not financially incentivized to build low-income housing because there's no, the cash flow and the promote structure is just very different than conventional housing. And so people only will develop low-income housing tax credit if there's government subsidies to pay for them, and the government subsidies are higher, the cost for the government. And so naturally, we're building more and more market rate than in affordable housing.
Yeah, and I think because the low-income housing tax credit policy isn't implemented in most other developing countries too, there's numbers like 80% of the people in Nigeria, as an example, which is the most populous country in Africa, that are relegated to building and constructing their own housing. So, regardless of how affordable we make multi-unit mass construction housing, there's still going to be a huge gap in demand versus supply, because that housing still isn't going to be affordable to the majority of the population. So again, I think trying to aggregate housing support services and find ways to eliminate fraud, even for individuals, let alone large-scale developers. But in the developing country, because such a large percentage of the population has to build their own housing, there's just nothing on the market for them that they can afford. How do we help ensure that they're connecting with people that are credible, that they have a FinTech platform that for the little money that they do have, we can ensure that it goes towards its intended purpose and they're not robbed or defrauded. And so instead of building 2 more or 3 more courses of brick on their home that they're building over time, because that's how they build there, that money, instead of going into a bank, they actually invested into building their home. It's their incremental construction process there. That money is actually going into that home construction and not lining someone's back pocket and they're running away with the funds. Because that's a huge part of the deficit of affordable housing in the majority of the world, where this is the case, where individuals are constructing most of the housing. What little money they have just goes in the toilet because there's not a secure, traceable way for them, both, conveyance of documents, smart contracts, even, legitimate blockchain titling and things of that nature, but also secure platforms for FinTech between, what we call sort of informal, sector individuals trying to build who are paying, in cash. So getting them on a platform with traceable tech and all these things is going to have a huge impact on 80%, of the population, where the majority of housing demand is going to be in the next 15 years.
Thank you, Nancy. Probably that's George and then Sergio. That you can just respond if you have any additional comment. Yeah.
My only addition to what Firas said is it's very dependent on country. So I have worked in affordable housing and sustainable housing in China and India and Singapore. Like in Singapore, as an example, 90% of all housing is controlled by the government. It's still unaffordable. And it's not got to do with fraud, it's got to do with other metrics. In India, similarly, there's very little fraud because there's no money that comes from government to sustain affordable housing. It's what you can afford as an individual, in which case it just depends on how smart you are and how you control your construction and what you do with it. And there are multiple agencies that allow you to do very cheap construction if you're able to do it. Similarly, I spent 3.5 years living in Beijing, very similar construct. There is funding from the federal government, but not really funding for affordable housing. So it tends to be driven by whatever the capital is. I think the answer to your question is very nuanced depending on the country. I don't necessarily see as much fraud here in the US, primarily because there's more metrics and standards. I think the bigger problem we have is access to money and just the slow pace of being able to do things.
I think the just my thoughts on based on my experience, I think that it's not a conversation of fraud, and I think that that's probably sort of positioned, if you will. It's really it's a matter of efficiency, and the World Bank reports the way the World Bank reports, where it's just a binary review of A plus B plus C. And then there's no contextual, what is A, what is B, what is C. And when you look at, yes, can we be more efficient? As George said, look, it depends on where you are in some of the rural parts of the world. For us, a project in Mexico, it cost us more to, transport the stuff, right, than it actually was to actually put it to work. So there are so many variables that go into place. It really depends on the sort of geo-economic, location, geographic, economic, and what do you have infrastructure around you? Can you, what about where's water coming from? And if there is no water and these people are in a rural area, now you have to spend all of this money on the sort of core infrastructure that is, that literally kills a project in some cases or kills the yield. And so I think that, I would, Nancy, I would defer to actually state that from a global perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of fraud that goes on all over the world, but if we're gonna sort of utilize this and socialize this as a global conversation, it's more about mismanagement and probably people not knowing that they could do it better, cheaper, and the fact that they just need to get it done. And there's a lot of timelines in these projects, and sometimes you end up spending more money than you need to get it executed by a timeline. So I think that there's too many more variables to look at, but I think that, blockchain technology could help, really manage that blockchain technology for the purposes of having RFPs, retaining information, managing the data, reporting post development. But there's many ways to sort of start to address that, but I just want to give my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think, as I said earlier, the differences in the issue between the developed world and the developing world are really more fraud and diversion versus efficiencies. So I completely agree with you on that. And just kind of, I'm glad you addressed at the end of your question, yes, blockchain, you're saying, or that kind of technology can increase the efficiencies, that we see, and trying to figure out how do we aggregate these types of technologies sort of in a systematic way on a single platform across the entire value chain. I think having that transparency on a single project will aid in the efficiencies. And even back to what Ross was saying on the low-income housing tax credits, it's so inefficient to do those kinds of jobs because of all the red tape and paperwork and all the extra, sort of reporting and things that you have to do, that being able to, and we've started conversations with HUD actually on this, is like, how can we streamline that process by not having all this reporting done on paper, but to actually be able to have it all in a single place with digitalized checklists. And, even if you're building green, as an example, you've got reams of paper where you're filling out reports to do, green construction criteria. And then you've got all of your LAHTC documents, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the efficiency piece that you hit on is a really big piece of it. And as Ross was saying, 20% of the cost, wow, that's a huge, huge cost savings that I do think technology can help us address.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, so that's considering time, and maybe that we can just move on to Robin's question, and then you can just see for the panelists if you have additional comment for Nancy's question or comment, and you can also include that in your next answer. And from the accelerator part, that's we definitely understand that there's a hard physical cost. There's the digital innovation can do this much. But there's the physical cost. That's why we also just engage with the sustainable cement and other type of physical producers and who can just address the other sort of the cost associated. How can we just reduce cost from the physical side? But digitalization, as what Nancy said, and also all panelists share, that it addresses certain part of the challenge. But definitely that it cannot address all the challenge, and there are still the physical costs that we need to just reduce and make it sustainable. And now let's move to Robbie.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the speakers. You've done such a wonderful job in explaining this. I have two questions, actually, very quick two-part questions. Number one, I'm very interested the same way that Faraz was talking about regarding modular technology and prefabricated. We've been looking into this as a large construction company for over a year now, and we're just so limited with the kind of projects that we can use such technology. And one of the issues that we have, and I would love your feedback as a panel, is there's no standard or consistency. We love BIM, for example, but it depends on the architect doing it. And if the architect on the project's not going to use that, a lot of architects won't even share with us digital files. They'll only share with us PDF files of the plans. So we're very limited with what we are able to do. The second part of my question is I'm very interested in what you were talking about, blockchain. I don't know much about it. I'm sure you guys know general contractors are generally very old school. I'm going in through a transformation of my own company as I took over of the last year. And there's a lot of pushback on any kind of technology. And I'm very curious on, how can, in the construction industry, blockchain be used? Are there existing solutions out there? And what kind of efficiency can we look for? Because we would love to bring down the cost for all our clients. It's for the benefit of everyone. That's it on my side. Thank you.
And would you like me to take this?
Actually, why don't we do reverse orders this time?
Sure.
So Sergio, do you want to address it, and then George, and then Faraz?
Probably that's considered the time that also collected the question from Brian, and then you can just answer them together. Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, my laptop tends to be temperamental. Am I coming in clear?
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, yes, yeah.
Yeah, good. I know it takes a bit. My question is a rather simple one, but I think it goes to the heart of, now it's starting to crystallize my own mind, how the end game is being contemplated. So my question was largely around what are some of the suggested innovation ideas that are coming to the marketplace right now in terms of trying to shorten the timeline most optimally from a permitting and zoning standpoint. I thought that was a very clever way to look at it and reduce it to its simplest form. And I think you covered some of this, but it'd be worth re-articulating if you have a few moments to do so. That's my question.
Thank you, Brian.
I didn't capture the question. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. The question is really one around permitting and zoning and some of the challenges that we all face and ways to shorten the timeline to get that done, to hasten the actual project time and construction time.
I guess since I'm the last one, I'll start first. In our experience, based on what we've seen in there's just, when you talk about issues with fraud and something that, that Nancy had brought up, the real issue of fraud is really on the permitting side, right? The zoning and all of that. And I think you're going to find a lot of municipalities that are slowly digitizing everything. And a lot of the work that we've been involved with is the digitization is only based on the capacity that exists locally. So speaking globally first and then locally, but from a global perspective, there is a lack of capacity to track and digitize, right? A lot of the work that we're doing with the UN, it's impossible to even just get people to digitize on the health side, never mind on the zoning and development. So I just think that there was still a long ways on the global perspective. On the US local perspective, you're seeing a lot of municipalities now. There's a lot of new technologies that are out there that are addressing, folks like Lend-Lease, everything they do, they utilize every single real estate development project, whether they're building homes or buildings, every aspect of every permit and how they fast track it, is digitized, but they're also spending, hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars to utilize the latest technology to work with, whether the city of New York or city of Miami, for that matter. So I think that, we're on our way, but I also think that now, being in a pandemic, it also is, there's, zero interest, I think, from the municipalities or cities or states or county governments to fast track anything that doesn't need to be fast tracked. So I think we're living in a sort of a bit of a juxtaposition at this point. But in a perfect world, I think, we would love to see everything digitized so that it can be fast tracked. And so, again, that's just a bit of my opinion.
And George, if you don't mind, let's have Ferris to respond first. I remember you said you have a hard stop at 11, and I want you to address that, and then, if you have anything to deal with, yeah. Sure, and I'm sorry, so I couldn't hear Sergio's answer, but if it's redundant, I apologize. So Rabia, you asked initially, the question is about modular construction and code issues. And you hit the nail on the head. First of all, modular construction, it doesn't work for each project. Part of the reason that we were not able to implement it in one of our projects in DC so far is the site geometry is a little bit challenging, but also the logistics of installation. You need to have public street closure, and sometimes if it's the main street, then it's really hard to close that street. So the modular construction has to address these logistics issue, and it has to address geometry, but there is significant advancement being made. And my hope is that, and other countries are a lot more advanced than we are here in the US in terms of modular construction, and have done it very well. So I think at some point the technology here in the US will catch up. Developers are not always pioneers, so it's going to take some time for it to become the mainstream, but I predict that eventually it will. And along the same line with code, it has not been an organized effort with different municipalities. It has been an ad hoc. Somebody brings a project to the municipality that's modular, they will look at it, and there's tremendous amount of challenges still because the majority of the units are being built off-site. So do you send an inspector there to do the rough inspection? It's just a little bit complicated, but I expect as people develop and build more modular, these issues will be addressed. I think the real issue with modular right now is really the logistics and installation, in my perspective, that the US has not yet figured out very well. But again, they're different, I'm generalizing, there are different parts in the country have done it better, in Seattle, Washington, they do it in a much better way than we do it here in the Mid-Atlantic region. To answer Brian's question about zoning and permitting, I sit on ULI Housing Initiative Council, and we've been bringing planning directors and government agencies, different parts in the Washington, D.C. region, to talk about how we can streamline the zoning process. The permitting is a little bit easier because it's a technical solution. And I would love to see a system where you built in a digitized artificial intelligence system that has all building codes, and then you can upload your drawings in a certain format where it can read it, analyze it,
and gives you back a quick review of deficiencies. This is my dream. It's not there yet. It's not, I haven't seen implemented, and I'm hoping that the industry would be able to do something like this. The other aspect to zoning is part of the problem is risk for developers and uncertainty. When you go through a zoning process, you don't really know what to expect at the end of the process. And so the more jurisdiction can work with communities to define predefined zoning with certain proffers and certain community benefits and certain community engagement process, then that streamlines the process. But now every time you go through that process is you're almost restarting it from the very beginning, and you're restarting the community process from the very beginning, and it just takes a long time. Just one comment, I'm very intrigued, and I agree 100% with what Sergio said about quality of life and community engagement. I mean, I worked on the public side as well, and in all of our master plans, we focus on economic development and what I call human capital master plan, and then the physical master plan. And ultimately, you want to build your human capital master plan first, and then build a physical plan to accommodate how your human capital master plan is going to view how actually people are going to live physically on the site. And that doesn't solve the challenge that you still have to build the structures. It doesn't solve the challenge that you still have to build the physical brick and mortar. And my concern and the industry challenge is the time and the cost it takes to build the physical brick and mortar takes a long time, and that needs to be shortened. And I just don't yet, our industry, like George said, we're still building the same way that we have done for thousands of years, and we don't really have streamlined innovations in that aspect that I have been able to use.
If I may add to that really quickly for us, and you're absolutely right, that we've been building the same way. Other than full modular, we've looked into, I don't know if you've looked, form steel framing that's done off-site, and then it doesn't require that kind of closing down the streets and you having a full module that's been lifted up by crane onto your building structure. Have you considered that? Because that's something we're very interested in, and producing that in one of our factories in Michigan. Have you looked into that, thought about that as kind of like an interim step to modular?
We haven't built anything using it yet, but we have two projects that we're actually looking at looking to do it that way and trying to understand the benefits of it.
Yeah, George, considering time, and we are 11 minutes now over the end, so go ahead.
Sure. I don't want to add, repeat anything that either Faraz or Sergio touched on. So let me touch on the one question that didn't get addressed as much, which is around blockchain. And I'll touch very lightly on offsite construction from the perspective of, because of now COVID-19, I've run into multiple conversations with both developers as well as operators of wanting to do offsite construction just because of COVID-19 and rethinking what the site looks like itself during construction. So there's a number of projects underway, including one by RMI that is DOE funded, to look at various new methods and technologies and do pilot projects around offsite construction with a COVID-19 focus, so keeping people far apart, etc., versus the traditional things we've always looked at is, when we do offsite construction or modular construction, is it worth doing modular construction if the factory is too far away that the transportation costs add up more than it would to do on site? Is it, there's the usual standard puts and takes that one has. Now there's an additional element to it because of COVID-19 and other similar pandemics expected downstream, to rethink the structure of the layout of how we build. So that's the only addition I would make to the modular construction thought process. But from a blockchain perspective, Ravi, there's been a couple of projects that I've been involved with, and I know there are dozens in the space that we are looking to try to figure out what we do with it. The one project I'll talk about is very, very standard from a blockchain technology perspective, is trying to do smart contracts for payments on a pretty large mining construction site. So we're talking $100 million plus construction site. where it was deemed worthy enough to try to figure out whether a pilot project using blockchain would work. And the essential mechanics is, in a way to cut out the bank and the middleman, and to have the vendors who deliver everything from steel to concrete to assets get paid via blockchain as soon as something is signed off on site, versus the 30-day wait and versus the arrears, and any financial savings that's made by shortcutting the financial transaction process to be given directly back as a percentage to people who sign up from the subcontractor community and the vendor community into the program. So that's one very simple example of how blockchain has been used. There's a lot of debate on whether or not, what is the level at which it makes sense to do, what type of project and what size of project. It's probably not useful for a very small project. But there are a couple of big companies looking at using publicly available blockchain kind of assets and devices like the blockchain fabric to try to see whether they can do simple projects like this that do that. So anything that you think requires contracts, anything that requires payments, that's a very simple place to start blockchain. The other place that you can also think about, some of the asset companies are thinking about, you talked about BIM, is around putting blockchain codes on anything that's designed in the design, put into construction, and then you need to have a site for it all during the operations of the asset itself. Again, only works above a asset class of a certain size and caliber, because it's not perhaps worth it yet to try to do it at a 3-story building today. But it might make sense for a plant or a factory or a mine or something larger, or a terminal at this point in time. So, Shakshan and Ann, that's my add to the 2 questions.
Thank you, George. And maybe that's, you can close it. Yeah.
So sorry for everybody for going over. It was such a great discussion. Thank you to all our panelists, and thank you for those of you who joined us after. I really enjoyed it, learned a lot, and we can certainly follow up with additional questions if you just send me or Xiaoshen, questions or additional things you want to follow up on. We can make sure it gets out to the panelists and so forth. Thank you again. And for those of you who stayed with us to the bitter end, much appreciated.
Yes, thank you. And also, for our next one will be on August the 31st. And the issue we are going to discuss is investing in sustainable housing. So then we'll continue this roundtable, and whoever are interested, welcome to just check this out. It's on the Eventbrite, and feel free to register for our next event. Again, thank you everyone, for the panelists, and also for everyone who stayed till now. And I hope that you enjoy this as much as we do. And after the roundtables that we're going to just continue more outreach for the acceleration program. Just stay tuned. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.